It was a dark and quiet night when Jake pulled into the gas station. The clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m. After hours of driving home from a long week of work, he was tired and eager to get back. The roads had been empty, and he welcomed the sight of the gas station with its flickering neon sign that read open. As he stepped out of his car, the wind howled through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. The gas station was small, with just 2 pumps and a dimly lit store. The air smelled of gasoline mixed with something sweet, almost sickening. Jake walked inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The interior was poorly lit, and an old man sat behind the counter, his eyes half closed as if he hadn't slept in days. "Fill her up?" the old man asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, please," Jake replied, feeling uneasy. He went back outside to pump gas, his mind wandering as he listened to the rustling leaves. As he filled the tank, Jake heard something moving in the bushes nearby. He turned but saw nothing. It was probably just a stray animal, he thought, dismissing the feeling of unease that crept into his mind. He finished pumping gas and headed back inside to pay. The old man was now staring at a small television in the corner, showing only static. The flickering light cast eerie shadows across the room. "You traveling far?" he asked without looking away from the screen. "Just heading home," Jake replied, trying to sound casual. "Looks like it might rain." "Always rains when you don't want it," the old man muttered, his voice distant. "You be careful out there. Not all things are what they seem." Jake frowned, feeling a chill run down his spine. Okay. Thanks for the warning," he said, handing over cash. He could sense something was off, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. After paying, Jake stepped outside, ready to get back on the road. But then he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a woman in a white dress, her long hair blowing in the wind. The dress seemed to glow in the dark. "Hey!" he called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and vanished into the trees. Feeling uneasy, Jake climbed into his car and locked the doors. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw only darkness. With a sigh of relief, he turned the engine on, ready to leave. Just then, the old man appeared at the door, waving his arms. "Wait," he shouted. "You shouldn't go yet." Jake rolled down his window. "Why not?" he asked, curiosity mingling with apprehension. "There's something in the woods," the old man said, his face pale. "You don't want to be out there alone." Jake hesitated. "What do you mean? What's in the woods?" he inquired, anxiety creeping into his voice. "Something that comes out at night. Something hungry," the old man replied, his voice shaking. Jake felt a surge of fear. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, half laughing to mask his unease. But the old man's serious expression made his stomach drop. "Just stay here a while." "You'll see," the old man insisted. Reluctantly, Jake decided to wait. He turned off his car and sat in silence, staring at the trees. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the rustling leaves. Just as he started to relax, a loud crash echoed from the woods. Jake's heart raced. He looked back at the old man, who was now watching the woods intently. "What was that?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. "Just wait," the old man whispered, pointing toward the tree line. Suddenly, shadows began to move among the trees. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw the woman again, but this time she wasn't alone. Other figures emerged, their faces hidden in darkness. They looked like they were watching him. "Help me," Jake shouted at her, desperation filling his voice. But she only smiled, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. Jake backed away, feeling trapped. The shadows pressed against the shutters, clawing at the metal with long, bony fingers. "Get inside," the old man shouted, slamming the door behind him. "We have to lock up." Jake stumbled into the store, his heart pounding. The old man hurried to the windows, pulling down the metal shutters. "They can smell fear," he muttered, his hands trembling. Jake's mind raced. "Who are they? What do they want?" he asked, panic rising in his chest. The old man turned, eyes wide with terror. "They want to take you. They want your soul." Outside, the shadows grew closer, whispering in a language Jake couldn't understand. He felt despair wash over him. The woman in white stood at the edge of the light, her face still hidden. "Help me," Jake shouted at her, desperation filling his voice. but she only smiled, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. Jake backed away, feeling trapped. The shadows pressed against the shutters, clawing at the metal with long, bony fingers. "Don't let them in," the old man yelled, grabbing a baseball bat from behind the counter. He handed it to Jake. "You'll have to fight." Jake felt a surge of courage. He took the bat, gripping it tightly. The shadows began to scream, their voices rising in a cacophony of terror. He could see their forms now twisted and ghastly, with hollow eyes and sharp claws. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, swinging the bat at the shutters. The shadows recoiled, but he could feel their presence pressing in. The old man stood by his side, swinging the bat wildly at the shadows. "They won't stop until they get what they want," he cried. With a sudden burst of energy, Jake pushed against the door, forcing it open. He ran out into the night, the cold air hitting his face. The shadows chased him, their whispers echoing in his ears. "Run!" the old man shouted, following close behind. Jake sprinted toward his car, fumbling for the keys in his pocket. The woman in white stood between him and the vehicle, her expression both alluring and menacing. "Help me!" she pleaded, her voice soft and sweet. But Jake knew better. He could see the hunger in her eyes. "No!" he shouted, pushing past her. He reached his car and jumped inside, locking the doors just in time. The shadows clawed at the windows, their faces twisted in rage. Jake turned the ignition, his heart pounding. He pressed down on the gas pedal and the car lurched forward. The gas station disappeared in his rearview mirror, but the shadows lingered at the edge of the light, screaming in fury. As he drove away, Jake glanced at the old man standing in the doorway, bat raised high. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving him behind, but he knew he had to survive. The road ahead was dark and lonely. He didn't stop driving until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Weeks later, Jake still couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He had told his friends about the gas station, but they laughed it off as just a tired man's imagination. But Jake knew what he had seen. One night, unable to sleep, he decided to drive back to the gas station. It was a stupid idea, but he needed closure. When he arrived, the gas station was abandoned, the windows shattered and the sign dark. It was as if time had forgotten it. He stepped inside, memories flooding back. The air was still and heavy, and the old man was nowhere to be found. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the television sat silent in the corner. As he turned to leave, he felt a cold breeze behind him. He turned slowly, and there she was, woman in white, standing in the doorway with a chilling smile. "Welcome back," she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty space. "You're just in time for the night." Jake's heart sank as shadows began to swirl around him, filling the room with a dark, haunting presence. He realized he had come back to the place he had tried to escape, and this time, there was no escape. It was late, and the only light came from the flickering neon sign outside the gas station. The clock on the wall showed 2:30 a.m. I was working the night shift, sitting behind the counter, feeling tired and a bit bored. Most nights were quiet, but I knew that could change at any moment. I was the only one in the station except for the odd trucker who would stop for gas or a snack. The store was filled with the smell of coffee and the faint scent of something fried from the hot food station. I sipped my cold coffee, wishing it was hotter and more flavorful. The night dragged on. I flipped through some magazines, not really interested in anything. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang, and I looked up. A man walked in, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. He looked around, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about him seemed off. "Hey there," I said, trying to sound friendly. "What can I help you with?" He didn't respond. Instead, he moved toward the back of the store, glancing over the shelves like he was searching for something. I watched him closely, feeling uneasy. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but my instincts were telling me to be cautious. After a few moments, he turned and walked back toward the counter. He had a bottle of soda in one hand and a bag of chips in the other. "Just these," he said, his voice low. "Sure," I replied, ringing up his items. He handed me a crumpled bill, and I gave him the change. He grabbed it quickly and shoved it into his pocket. "Thanks," he mumbled, looking around again, and then walked out of the store without another word. I breathed a sigh of relief as the door closed behind him. I went back to my magazines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced outside to see if he was still in the parking lot, but the darkness made it hard to see. Just then, another customer came in. It was an older woman, probably in her 60s, wearing a long coat. She seemed friendly and smiled as she approached the counter. "Hello, dear," she said cheerfully. "Could I get a cup of coffee, please?" "Of course," I replied, feeling a little better. I poured her a cup and handed it to her. "Do you need anything?" "No, this is perfect," she said, taking a sip. "You're working late, huh? Not many people around at this hour." "Yeah, it can get pretty quiet," I replied. "But I've been here for a while. I'm used to it." As she paid, I noticed the door opened again, and the man in the hoodie walked back in. My heart raced. He was acting strange, looking around again as if he was searching for something. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to the woman, my voice steady but my heart pounding. I walked to the front of the store, trying to keep an eye on both of them. "Hey," I said to the man, trying to sound firm. "Can I help you with something?" He turned to me, his expression blank. "No, I'm just looking," he said, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. "Okay," I replied, not wanting to escalate anything. I turned back to the older woman, who was now standing by the coffee machine, watching the man as closely as I was. The man walked past us and out the door again. I glanced at the woman, and she nodded, her brow furrowed. "He doesn't seem right," she whispered. "I know," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's up to no good." Just then, the man walked back in for a third time. This time, he was looking over his shoulder, as if he was afraid someone was following him. My heart raced again, and I felt a rush of fear. What was happening? The woman grabbed my arm. "We should call the police," she said urgently. "Something isn't right." Before I could respond, the man suddenly turned and rushed toward us. "Give me the money," he shouted, pulling something from his pocket. It was a knife, glinting in the fluorescent light. "Hey, stop," I shouted, stepping in front of the woman. "You don't have to do this." But he lunged forward, and I reacted without thinking. I grabbed the nearest thing, a bottle of soda from the counter, and threw it at him. It hit him in the chest, and he stumbled back, surprised. "Run," I yelled to the woman, who stood frozen in shock. She finally snapped out of it and bolted toward the door. I followed her, my heart racing. I could hear the man yelling behind us, but I didn't look back. We rushed outside into the cold night air, and I ran toward the gas pumps. The older woman was already at her car, fumbling with her keys. "Get in," she shouted. I jumped into the passenger seat, and she started the engine. The man burst out of the store just as we pulled away. I glanced back to see him standing there, his face twisted in rage. "Go, go, go," I shouted, and she pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires squealed as we sped away from the gas station. We drove in silence for a few moments, both of us shaking. "What just happened?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought he was just a strange customer, but that was terrifying." I nodded, still feeling adrenaline pumping through my veins. "We need to call the police," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'll report what happened." I dialed, and as I spoke to the operator, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still in danger. The woman kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her hands shaking on the wheel. "I hope he didn't follow us," she said, her voice quivering. "Just keep driving," I said, trying to stay calm. "The police will be able to help us." After a few minutes, I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and fear. "They're on their way," I told her, "but we need to stay alert." We drove for a while, my heart still racing as I kept watching the road behind us. The darkness felt heavy, and I was terrified that the man would appear out of nowhere. After a few more minutes, I finally let out a sigh of relief. "I think we lost him," I said, glancing at the woman beside me. "But we should still be careful." Just as I said that, a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and there he was, standing in the middle of the road, his arms outstretched. "Stop the car," I shouted, but the woman didn't hear me. She swerved to avoid him, and I felt my stomach drop as the car veered off the road. "Hold on," she screamed, and we crashed into a tree. The impact was jarring, and I felt a sharp pain in my side as the airbag deployed. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "I think so," she said, breathing heavily. But we have to get out of here. We unbuckled our seatbelts and climbed out of the car. The man in the hoodie was coming toward us, a menacing look on his face. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. We took off into the woods, the darkness swallowing us whole. I could hear his footsteps behind us, getting closer. We ran through the trees, branches scratching at our skin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we tried to put as much distance as possible between us and that man. "Where do we go?" she gasped, her breath coming in quick bursts. "I don't know," I yelled back, trying to focus. "We just need to keep moving." We stumbled deeper into the woods, the sounds of the night growing louder. The rustling leaves and distant animal calls filled the air, but all I could hear was the pounding of our feet on the ground. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. "No!" I cried, scrambling to get back up. The woman turned back to help me, but I could hear the man's footsteps closing in. "Go," I shouted. "I'll hold him off." "I can't leave you," she yelled, panic in her eyes. "You have to," I insisted. "Run, I'll catch up." She hesitated for a moment, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Finally, she turned and ran deeper into the woods. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I had to face him. I couldn't let him hurt her. I picked myself up and looked around, searching for a way to defend myself. I spotted a thick branch lying on the ground and picked it up, gripping it tightly. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened for any signs of him. The darkness felt heavy around me, and I could feel my pulse racing. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. I tightened my grip on the branch and prepared myself. The man stepped into view, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "There you are," he said, his voice low and taunting. "Thought you could escape." I swung the branch at him with all my strength, but he dodged to the side. "You're going to regret that," he hissed, lunging toward me. I swung again, this time catching him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, surprised. "You're tougher than I thought," he said, wiping blood from his lip. "Get away from me," I shouted, fear fueling my anger. I swung the branch again, aiming for his head, but he grabbed my wrist and twisted it. Pain shot through me, and I dropped the branch. He shoved me back, and I stumbled to the ground. I felt the cold dirt beneath me, and panic surged through me as he advanced, his face twisted with rage. "I'm going to enjoy this," he sneered, raising his knife. Just then, I heard a loud noise, a car engine roaring to life. My heart raced as I realized it was the older woman returning. She had called for help. "Hey!" she shouted from the edge of the woods. The man turned, startled. "Get away from him!" In that moment of distraction, I scrambled back, looking for anything I could use. I spotted the branch again and grabbed it, holding it up in front of me. "Stay away," I yelled, feeling a surge of determination. The man turned back to me, his face twisting in anger. "You think you can fight me?" he growled. But just then, headlights flooded the area, illuminating him. He froze, his expression shifting from anger to fear. The car was coming closer, and I could see the flashing lights of the police car behind it. "Get on the ground," an officer shouted as he jumped out of the car. The man's eyes widened, and he bolted into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. "Are you okay?" The woman rushed over to me, concern etched on her face. "I saw the man chasing you." "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaking. "I think he ran away." The officer approached, radio in hand. "We got a report of a disturbance," he said, looking us over. "Did you see where he went?" "He ran into the woods," I said, pointing in the direction he had fled. "He had a knife." The officer nodded, signaling for backup on his radio. "Stay here," he ordered, and he disappeared into the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I turned to the older woman, relief flooding over me. "Thank you for coming back," I said, my voice shaky. I wasn't going to leave you," she said, her eyes filled with kindness. "I'm so glad you're okay." After a few minutes, the officer returned with a few more officers. "We didn't find him," he said, frustration in his voice, "but we'll keep searching." "Thank you," I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The danger was finally over. As the officers gathered information and assured us we were safe, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The night had turned from eerie to terrifying, but we had made it through. Finally, the officers finished their questions, and I turned to the woman. "Do you want to get a cup of coffee?" I asked. I could really use one after all of this. She smiled, relief shining in her eyes. I would love that. As we walked toward the police car, I realized how lucky I was. We had faced danger together, and now we were safe. The gas station, once a place of fear, felt like a memory of survival. Let's get that coffee, I said, and together we stepped into the light, leaving the darkness behind us. I was driving through the quiet back roads late at night. The sky was pitch black, with no stars and no moonlight. My car's gas gauge was getting lower and lower, and I had no choice but to find a gas station soon. After a few more miles, a faint glow appeared down the road. It was a small gas station, the only light in miles of dark. I pulled into the gas station, the only car there. The old sign above the station read, Oak Hill Gas. It was flickering as if it might go out any moment. The building looked old and worn, the windows dusty, and the pumps looked like they hadn't been used in a while. I got out of the car, feeling a chill as I stepped into the night air. The wind whistled softly, and everything was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter around me, telling myself it was just another gas station and that I'd be back on the road soon. I grabbed the gas pump and started filling up my tank. The machine clicked and clanged, sounding tired as if it were as old as the station itself. My eyes kept drifting to the dark windows of the store. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I saw no one. After a minute or two, the pump stopped. I put it back, closed my gas cap, and took a deep breath. Just then I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing in one of the windows. I froze, staring at the spot where I thought I'd seen something. The shadow was gone, but my heartbeat quickened. Probably just my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I looked toward the windows again, I noticed something strange. There were handprints on the glass, smudged and smeared, as if someone had pressed their hands there and dragged them down slowly. The prints looked fresh, almost too fresh, like someone had just been there. I walked cautiously toward the store, feeling uneasy. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and a little bell above it rang. Inside, the lights were dim and flickering. The shelves were nearly empty, holding only a few dusty cans and snacks that looked like they'd been there for years. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. Silence. There was no answer. I felt a strong urge to leave, but I wanted to pay for my gas. I stepped closer to the counter where an old register sat. The place was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I looked around, hoping to see an attendant or at least a sign of someone. Then I heard it. A faint rustling sound from the back of the store. It was soft at first, like the sound of paper crumpling, but it grew louder, shifting into the sound of footsteps. My heart pounded, and I backed up slowly, not wanting to see who or what was making. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind me, soft but sharp. "Need some help?" I spun around, my heart racing. Behind the counter stood a man. He wore an old, stained gas station uniform and had a strange, blank look in his eyes. His face was pale, and he didn't blink as he stared at me. Just wanted to pay for my gas," I stammered, feeling my mouth go dry. He nodded slowly, not breaking his gaze. "Cash only," he said in a low voice, pointing to the register. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, handing them to him. His hand was cold as he took the money, and his fingers brushed against mine, sending a chill through me. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No, just passing through," I replied, feeling uncomfortable under his intense stare. He nodded again, but his expression didn't change. "Not many people come here, especially at night." I forced a weak smile, feeling the urge to leave growing stronger. "Well, I guess I got lucky finding this place." The man didn't smile back. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying me. "Be careful on these roads," he said, his voice distant. "Strange things happen out here." I nodded, not wanting to continue the conversation. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, he spoke again. "Wait." I froze, turning back to him. His eyes seemed darker now, as if a shadow had fallen over his face. "Take this," he said, reaching under the counter. He pulled out a small flashlight and held it out to me. "For the road. You'll need it." I hesitated, but took the flashlight, muttering a quick thank you. Without another word, I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The air felt colder, and I shivered as I walked back to my car. I got in, locking the doors behind me. The man was still watching me through the store window, his face barely visible in the dim light. I started the engine, but as I glanced at the gas gauge, I realized something strange. The needle hadn't moved at all. It was still just as low as before. I looked back at the pump, my stomach twisting with dread. I had just filled up the tank, hadn't I? But the gauge didn't lie. My car was still almost empty. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the man's warning. Strange things happen out here. I considered going back inside to ask him what was going on, but something stopped me. I had a feeling I didn't want to hear his answer. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Just drive, I told myself. Get away from this place. I put the car in gear and drove away from the gas station, the flickering lights disappearing in my rearview mirror. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty. I turned on the flashlight the man had given me, setting it on the seat next to me. A few minutes later, I noticed the fog. It started out as a thin mist along the edges of the road, but it quickly grew thicker, swallowing up the road ahead. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down, my eyes straining to see. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the side of the road, a woman standing in the fog, her back turned to me. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding. She didn't move, just stood there, her long dark hair hanging down over her shoulders. I rolled down the window slightly, calling out to her. "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn around. She just stood there, completely still. I felt a chill run through me as I waited, hoping she would move or say something. But she remained silent, a shadow in the fog. I rolled the window back up, deciding to drive around her. As I eased the car forward, I glanced at her again, and that's when I saw her face. She was staring directly at me, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I felt a jolt of terror as I hit the gas, speeding away from her as fast as I could. The fog thickened, and my hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but she was gone. The road stretched out endlessly, the fog swallowing everything around me. Minutes passed, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The road didn't feel right, as if I was driving in circles. I checked my phone, hoping to get directions, but there was no signal. The battery was draining quickly, dropping by the minute. Then, just ahead, I saw it, the gas station. Oak Hill Gas. The same flickering sign, the same pumps, the same eerie silence. I had driven in a complete circle without realizing it. I pulled into the parking lot, my heart racing. The store lights were still on, and the man was standing inside, watching me through the window. His expression was blank, but his eyes held a strange gleam. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and walked back to the store. The bell rang as I entered, and the man looked at me, his mouth curling into a slight smile. "Back so soon?" he asked. It was nearly midnight when I found myself driving alone on a dark, empty road. I had been on the highway for hours, tired and hungry. My gas gauge was low, and there was no sign of civilization for miles. Then, I saw a faint glow up ahead. It was a gas station, small and old, with a flickering neon sign that read, "Midway Gas and Stop." I felt relieved, finally, a place to fill up the tank and stretch my legs. I slowed down, turning into the station. The station was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no other cars around, and the entire area felt strangely deserted. The lights above the gas pumps were dim, and the building itself looked worn, like it hadn't been updated in years. I stepped out of my car, breathing in the cool night air. It felt oddly still, like even the wind had stopped. There was a chill that went right through me. Trying to shake it off, I grabbed the gas pump and started filling up. As the gas flowed, I looked around the station. There were 2 large windows at the front of the store, both dusty and covered in what looked like smudged fingerprints. I could see rows of shelves inside, mostly empty. There was an old cash register on the counter and some faded posters on the wall. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak, like a door opening. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart beat a little faster. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I finished pumping the gas, put the nozzle back, and looked down at my gas gauge. To my surprise, the needle hadn't moved. It was still pointing to E, like I hadn't pumped any gas at all. "Come on," I muttered, looking at the pump to check if I had done something wrong, but everything seemed normal. The display showed the amount I had pumped and the money I owed. I felt a strange sense of dread. Maybe it was just a malfunction, I thought. But I needed gas, so I decided to go inside the store to talk to someone about it. The bell above the door rang as I stepped inside. The air inside the store was cold, colder than outside. A shiver ran down my spine. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows along the wall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty store. No one answered. I walked up to the counter, looking for an attendant, or at least a sign of life. There was a half-full coffee cup on the counter, but it looked cold, as if it had been sitting there for a while. Next to the cup was a set of keys and a small notebook with scribbles all over the Just then, I heard a faint shuffling sound from behind one of the shelves. I turned, squinting into the dim light. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. A man stepped out from behind the shelf. He was tall, with pale skin and dark sunken eyes. His clothes were old and stained, and he moved slowly, almost like he was in a daze. "Need something?" he asked, his voice low and flat. Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just pumped gas, but it didn't register on my gauge. I think something might be wrong with the pump." He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged. "Pump's fine," he said. "Sometimes it just takes a minute." "Right," I said, feeling uneasy. "Could I pay with a..." He shook his head slowly. "Cash only." I hesitated. I had some cash on me, but something about the situation felt wrong. Still, I didn't want to argue. I took out a 20 and handed it to him. His cold fingers brushed against mine as he took the money, sending a chill up my arm. "Thanks," I said, backing away toward the door. "I'll just be on my way." He didn't say anything, just watched me with those empty eyes as I turned and left the store. Back outside, I took a deep breath, relieved to be out of that strange, cold building. I got into my car, started the engine, and checked the gas gauge again. It hadn't moved. My tank was still empty. Frustrated, I tapped the gauge, hoping it was just stuck, but nothing changed. I looked back at the gas station, wondering if I should go back inside, but the thought of seeing that man again made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to drive down the road a little, hoping maybe the gauge would correct itself after a few miles. I pulled out of the station and started driving, the dark road stretching out before me. But as I drove, something strange happened. After a few minutes, I saw lights up ahead, another gas station, or at least, I thought it was another gas station, but as I got closer, I realized it was the same one. Midway Gas and Stop, the same flickering neon sign, the same empty parking lot, the same creepy, abandoned look. I stopped the car, staring in disbelief. How could I have circled back to the same place? I had driven straight, hadn't I? There hadn't been any turn. Feeling a mix of confusion and fear, I turned the car around and drove back the way I'd come. This time, I kept my eyes glued to the road, making sure I didn't miss any turns. But after another few minutes, the gas station appeared again, right in front of me. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew something was very wrong. It was like I was trapped, unable to escape this place. Desperate, I got out of the car and looked around. The road stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. There was no sign of life, no other cars, no houses, just the gas station and the endless. I looked up at the station. The man was standing at the window, watching me. His face was partially hidden by the shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unsettling. Taking a deep breath, I walked back toward the station, hoping to find some answers. As I entered, the bell above the door chimed again, and the man looked at me, his face blank and expressionless. "You're back," he said, as if he'd expected me. "Why can't I leave?" I demanded, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Every time I drive away, I just end up back." The man tilted his head, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "This place, it has a way of keeping people," he said quietly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. People come and go, some leave, some... I took a step back, feeling the urge to run, but where would I go? I was trapped, caught in some kind of loop with no way out. What do I have to do to leave? I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the door and locked it, the sound echoing through the empty store. My heart pounded as he turned to me, his eyes cold and empty.